Now that your bud rep is properly set up, you are ready to move to Section 2. Section 2 describes best practices for completing the rent table worksheet. Now that we have the budget worksheet populated, we can complete the rent table worksheet. Both new and existing developments will need to complete this worksheet. With this worksheet, start by entering the property information. Remember, where you see green print, you can enter data in those cells. Enter the property name, the development ID number, or D number, and the city where the development is located. In the yellow box, you have the option to use the rent table to calculate gross potential rent, GPR, or to use the manual GPR entry on line 68. For developments with project-based rental assistance, such as Section 8, check the first circle, Use Rent Table to Calculate GPR. For developments without rental assistance, such as the tax credit program, where rents can change once per year but not all in the same month, check the second circle to use manual GPR entry on line 68. I will show you how to complete the rent matrix worksheet to calculate the gross potential rent on an upcoming slide. Next, column A of the box highlighted is where you enter the most restrictive program. Detail all funding sources involved with this property and the rent limit percentage that you are required to comply with for each bedroom style. Next, column B is where you enter the rent limit appropriate for each funding source. Note that rent restrictions can change annually. You can find the most current rent limit information on Minnesota Housing's website in the Quick Links section on the left side of your screen. Select Rent and Income Limits. The rents included on this rent table are for demonstration purposes only and do not reflect the current rent limits. If you have questions about what funding sources apply to your development, consult with the owner. Next, column D is where you enter the number of rooms per bedroom style. How many rooms are in a one-bedroom? Look no further than the table located at the top of the page. Next, column E is where you enter the number of units for each bedroom type per each funding source. Column F is where you enter the square footage for each bedroom type. This information may be referenced in the development's regulatory agreement. If not, consult with the owner. Next, column I is where you enter the rents most recently approved by Minnesota Housing before any rent increase you may be requesting. Next, column J is where you enter the utility allowance. Let's review how you find these numbers. A utility allowance schedule can come from a variety of sources. For a development with rental assistance, such as Section 8, the contract administrator will provide it to you. For a development without rental assistance, such as the tax credit program, you will most often use the utility allowance schedule from your local PHA or HRA. I have had success finding these schedules on the Housing Link website, which is www.housinglink.org. Because the utility allowance can change each year, it is important to remember where you found it. Here is an example of the utility allowance schedule from the Minneapolis PHA. Note the effective date at the top of the page. For this demonstration, the residents pay their own electric. The appropriate amounts are circled per building and bedroom type and totaled at the bottom of the page. Enter the totals in column J on the rent table. Here's an important point. Remember to submit the utility allowance schedule as an attachment to your 2019 budget submission. Your budget will not be reviewed without it. Now, let's finish filling out the rent table. In column J, enter the numbers that you have calculated from the appropriate utility allowance schedule. Note that columns K and L are black print. These cells are protected, and they contain formulas that cannot be changed. Next, in column M, enter the proposed new rents. Remember not to include the utility allowance amount with the proposed new rent. Column N reflects a protected cell. It contains the formula that automatically totals the proposed new rent with the utility allowance. Next, in columns O and P, the percent of increase and dollar increase reflect the increase, or sometimes decrease, from the current rents to the proposed new rents. Staff will evaluate and approve all rent increases as a part of the budget review process. I will explain that evaluation process in an upcoming slide. Next, column Q reflects the effective month, or the month the proposed rents will take effect. This column is typically filled in for developments with rental assistance, where the contract dictates when the rents change. For properties with calendar fiscal years, if the contract rent changes in February, enter a 2. If it changes in July, enter a 7. For developments with non-calendar fiscal years, the number 1 is associated with the month the fiscal year begins. For example, with a July to June fiscal year, if the contract rent changes in February, enter an 8. If it changes in July, enter a 1. For developments without rental assistance, where the rent changes occur at lease renewals or at turnover, leave this column blank. Next, column R reflects the rent gap. Note that it appears in black print. The cell is protected, and the formula cannot be changed. The calculation determines the difference between the most restrictive gross rent from column B and the proposed gross rent from column N. Staff will consider this calculation to see if management is maximizing its rent potential. If the rent gap is negative, the proposed gross rent is greater than the most restrictive rent for the governing program. In this case, staff would request an explanation. An important component of the rent table is the program matrix. It communicates which units are fixed to certain funding sources, which units are employee or owner occupied, which units receive rental assistance, and which units receive an operating subsidy. Check all of the boxes that apply. The regulatory agreement, various declarations, or other loan documents are good sources for this information. If you have questions, consult with the owner. We are almost finished with the rent table. I want to spend some time reviewing the Rent Matrix Optional worksheet. For developments with rental assistance where rents are effective on a certain date reflected in a contract, it is not necessary to complete this optional rent matrix. Be sure that you have selected Use Rent Table to calculate GPR button, and be certain that you have designated an effective month in column Q. If you have an internal rent matrix, I encourage you to submit it with your budget as long as it contains the same information. Be sure that it matches the totals on row 68 of the rent table. If you decide to use this template, you first need to click Size the Rent Matrix. In the dialog box, enter the total number of units at the property. The correct number of rows will appear for you to list all the units at the property. In column A, list the unit number. If you ever need to change the number of units in this table, you must first click cell A5, then click Size the Rent Matrix and enter the correct number of units. Failure to do this will result in you adding or deleting the incorrect number of rows needed to populate the chart. In columns B and C, list the current rents and the new rents. In column D, enter the number associated with the month the proposed new rents will take effect due to either turnover or lease renewals. For example, if the lease ends in April, you would enter the number 5 since the rent increase will take effect in May. For developments with non-calendar fiscal years, the number 1 is associated with the month the fiscal year begins. For example, with a July to June fiscal year, if the lease ends in April, you would enter 11 for the rent to increase in May. Be sure to adjust accordingly. Note that the only green print is contained in columns A through D. The numbers in column D will populate the rest of the spreadsheet and will calculate the gross potential rent, or GPR, for each month in the fiscal year. The last step is to type each month's gross potential rent on line 68 of the rent table. You have made it to the last slide pertaining to the rent table. Manually enter the monthly gross potential rents, or GPR, at the bottom of the rent table. The total amount will automatically populate in the budget worksheet in the 2019 proposed budget column. Remember, the Use Manual GPR entry on line 68 must be selected at the top of the rent table for it to populate the budget worksheet correctly. Rent increases for developments without rental assistance are typically requested once a year. Some developments request the rent increase with the budget submission. Other developments request it when the tax credit rent limits are published in the spring. Agency staff will only approve one increase per year. The rent increase must be submitted in writing, and the increase is not effective until it is approved in writing by staff. If your rent increase exceeds 5% of the current rent, staff will review the information to see if the market can support the rents proposed. Staff may request a list of comparable properties that are achieving similar rents and will confirm that the gross rents do not exceed the governing limits. Remember to submit your utility allowance schedule. Finally, staff will want to understand the impact of the rent increase upon the current residents. Staff may request the current income levels of existing residents to determine if they may be displaced as a result of the new rents. For long-term homeless or high-priority homeless units without a rent subsidy, be sure to review the rent policy for unsubsidized units. This information can be found on the Asset Management homepage. Keep in mind that there are many factors to be considered when determining rent increases. Consult with your assigned housing management officer if you need to discuss rent increases in more detail. You have now finished the second section of submitting a successful operating budget. Section 3 explains expenses and reviews how to submit your budget using Box.com. If you have questions or if you have notes about the budget that you want to review in more detail, please refer to the information listed on this slide to contact the housing management officer assigned to your property. The names and email addresses are also listed on the asset management page of Minnesota Housing's website at www.minhousing.gov.